Australia's decision to send 49 M1A1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine certainly sounds like a bold move on paper. But before we get too excited, let's take a closer look. At first glance, it feels like Australia is being charitable, helping Ukraine in its time of need. But is this really the grand gesture it appears to be? Or is it more like Australia clearing out its military junk, sending over some old gear that is well past its prime? The announcement by Australia's Minister for Defence Industry, Pat Conroy, was certainly dressed up nicely. He claimed these tanks would provide Ukraine with much needed firepower and mobility. However, here is the catch. These are not the latest Abrams tanks with all the bells and whistles. The M1A1 Abrams that Australia is shipping off are not exactly the cutting-edge war machines you would expect in modern warfare. In fact, they are kind of like those clunky cell phones from the early 2000s, fine for their time but not something you would brag about today. You can see this report, these tanks have some serious performance issues. Australia originally purchased these tanks from the US quite some time ago. And while they have served their purpose, Australia's military is already moving on to the newer, advanced M1A2 models. So, what's a country to do with its soon-to-be retired fleet of older tanks? Well, why not donate them to Ukraine and score some goodwill points, while also making space in the garage for the new toys? From Australia's perspective, it is a great 2-for-1 deal. They clear out their aging tanks and Ukraine gets, well, they get tanks, old ones. The tanks Australia is sending are said to be worth $164 million, which when added to their other military aid to Ukraine, pushes Australia's total contribution past $1.3 billion mark. That sounds impressive, right? But if we dig a little deeper, some of these Abrams might be better suited for a scrapyard than a battlefield. After all, Ukraine already has a few of these tanks, courtesy of the US, and let's just say their performance has been less than stellar. The Abrams tanks that Ukraine received earlier have been anything but invincible on the battlefield. They have been prime targets for Russian drones, turning into expensive scrap metal faster than anyone anticipated. There have been reports of Ukraine pulling these tanks from the front lines because they are just too vulnerable in modern warfare. These tanks, once hailed as unstoppable, now seem more like sitting ducks waiting for a drone strike to swoop in. If these are the battle-hardened tanks that Australia is offering, Ukraine might want to keep the receipt. What is also interesting is the timing of Australia's decision. Ukraine has been asking for tanks for over a year now, even putting together a flashy appeal video to get Australia's attention. But for months, Australia seemed to ignore the request. Now, seemingly out of nowhere, they have decided to ship these aging machines across the globe. It feels a bit like a delayed RSVP to a party that started last year. Moreover, it is not just that these tanks are old, they're also not designed for the type of warfare that Ukraine is facing. The M1A1s were built for NATO-style combat where air support and artillery do a lot of the heavy lifting before tanks even roll out. Ukraine, on the other hand, has been struggling with the lack of sufficient air support, making these tanks less of a strategic asset and more of a liability. Without the right support, these Abrams could just end up as more easy targets for Russia's well-equipped forces. So while Ukraine might appreciate this gesture on the surface, you have to wonder who is really benefiting here. Australia gets to offload its outdated tanks and look like the good guy on the international stage. Meanwhile, Ukraine gets a fleet of tanks that may need some serious upgrades just to survive on the battlefield. If you ask me, Australia is walking away with the better deal. Newer tanks for themselves and a nice PR boost to boot.